He died in 399 BC. He never even came close to seeing America on the rise, and yet Socrates may have predicted exactly where we're headed. Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to Creating the Future with me, Dr. Brent Simpson, where we dive into stories and truths and deep questions that help us shape our faith, our families, and our future. And today I think we're going to get into some deep stuff. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I want to start with a question that I want to sit with you. And the question is this: what if the system you were raised to believe in, the system of democracy, a system that most people in the Western world would consider the gold standard of civilization, what if it was described by one of history's greatest thinkers as a guaranteed path to collapse? Now, that's not a political statement, that's a philosophical one. And the man who made it ended up paying for that statement with his life. Now, who is this man? His name is Socrates. And today we begin what I think is going to be a lot of fun over the next couple episodes, where I want to look at philosophy. You know, my bachelor's degree is in philosophy and apologetics, and I don't want to look at philosophy from a perspective of an academic exercise only, and I don't want it to be a dusty relic that you don't want to look back on and you want to cut off of this podcast already. I actually want it to be a lot of fun. I want this to be something that's alive. I want this philosophy to have teeth, and I think you're going to see some things in the philosophy that I share with you and some of these ancient philosophers that once you understand them is literally going to change the way you think about civilization, life, what's happening around us especially. So let's begin where Western philosophy itself begins, with a man who never wrote a single word himself, whose ideas survived only because of his students, because they refused to let his ideas die, and a man who ultimately was executed for asking too many questions. Let's talk today for a few minutes about Socrates and his opinion on democracy, which is going to be very relevant to us today. Now, who is Socrates? Socrates lived in roughly around 470 to 399 BC. He is widely regarded as the father of Western philosophy, though I want to be precise about that. There were many other thinkers before Socrates. There were pre-Socratic thinkers before him, but Socrates did something that was a revolutionary turn. He started looking at philosophy a little bit different, and he wasn't asking some of the same questions they were asking before. He was asking things not like, what is the universe made of, which is the philosophies before him. He was asking, how should a human being live? What is justice? What is virtue? What is truth itself? He's asking those kind of questions, and he would walk barefoot all over Athens, engaging anyone who would talk to him in rigorous conversations. And he questioned politicians, he questioned poets, craftsmen, he questioned generals, literally anybody he could talk to. He would question them, and he had a habit of doing something that made powerful people feel extremely uncomfortable. He would ask them to define the things that they claimed to know. He would ask them to systematically demonstrate what they know, and what they found is that they oftentimes had a very difficult time doing that. In fact, this method of asking probing questions to expose the limits of someone's understanding eventually becomes known as the Socratic method, and maybe you've heard of the Socratic method. That comes from Socrates himself, and it's still to this day the primary method used in law schools and philosophy departments all over the world. So, Socrates left no written works. Everything we know about him comes through his students, and primarily his most famous student being Plato, who recorded his dialogues in works such as the Republic, the Apology, and the Gorgias. And through those writings, we know who Socrates is, and we know that Socrates was deeply, fundamentally skeptical of democracy. Now, before you just turn me off, just stay with me and let's see why. And I think you'll see some interesting comparisons to his time and his issues he had with democracy and today. So, to understand why, let's look at democracy from its original form, not like we have it today, very different than we have it today. Athens, Greece, in the 5th century BC was the birthplace of democracy, and Athenian democracy was direct. There was no representatives. Citizens did not elect someone to vote for them. Citizens gathered together in large assemblies. They debated things, and they voted directly on every major decision, whether it be war or laws or treaties or leadership appointments. If you were a free male citizen of Athens, oftentimes if you were a landowner, then you had a direct voice in every major decision that was made. Now, of course, that's a small population of Athens to be able to pull that off because the majority of Athens were not male landowners and people of clout like that, but it was still a huge group of people, and they voted on everything. Now, on paper, this seems remarkable. It seems like freedom, but in practice, it created a whole system where the outcome of any decision depended entirely on whoever showed up that day. Whatever mood the crowd was in, and whoever was persuasive in that moment ended up leading the decisions. So you can quickly see where there's some issues here. And Socrates looked at this system and he identified what he believed was a fatal structural flaw to the basic system of democracy. Now just listen, hear me out before you start judging me. He believed that democracy gives equal weight to the informed and the uninformed, equal weight to the expert and the amateur, equal weight to the person who has spent years studying a question and the person who has spent 0 minutes even considering the question. Think about that. The person who spent years studying and the person who's never even thought about it both get an equal vote. Well, that's a problem. And he believed that a society built on that foundation would eventually make catastrophically bad decisions, not necessarily out of malice or something like that, but simply out of ignorance. And Socrates illustrated this with an argument that I find remarkably difficult to dismiss, and people of his time period also found difficult to dismiss. He asked, if you were seriously ill, if your life were on the line, would you put it to a vote on who the doctor should be? Would you gather a crowd together and ask for a show of hands on who should perform the surgery? Would you let the most enthusiastic voice in the room make the medical decision? Well, of course not. You would find the most skilled, most experienced, most qualified physician that you could. Why? Because you understand instinctively that medicine is a domain of expertise, and expertise matters, perhaps more than anything else, especially when the stakes are high. So Socrates asked the obvious next question: why do you not apply the same logic to governance that you would apply to medicine and other fields like that? Why do you allow a crowd, most of whom have no training in economics, no experience in military strategy, no understanding of law or political philosophy, why do you let those people make a decision that determines the fate of an entire society? That's dangerous. And so to Socrates, this wasn't democracy. This was organized ignorance. It's everybody coming together and making a decision. And so the ignorant got just as much vote as the intelligent. And he believed that governance, like medicine, like architecture, like navigation, is a skill, and skills must be developed. They must be cultivated. They must be earned. A ship is not steered by a vote of the passengers. It is steered by the navigator who knows the sea. I think a modern analogy to this might be a football game in a football stadium, and how chaotic and how crazy would it be if all the fans voted every time on what the next play should be, or should they bench the player or not, or what have you. That would be total chaos. Why? Because the fans don't have the expertise that the coaches have. So therefore, we want coaches with specific skill sets and specific expertises that can then actually make a difference on the field with the players. We don't want to give that to people who don't have that experience and that expertise. And so Socrates talked about a danger within the crowd. He identified a second weakness in the democratic system and process, one that perhaps is even more sobering than the first one. See, he believed that democracy by its nature rewards a very specific type of person. Not the wisest person, not the most qualified person, not necessarily the best person, but it actually empowers the most persuasive person, or maybe the best orator, the best one at rhetoric, the most skilled manipulator of public emotion ends up leading the crowd and ends up leading the charged. See, he believed that in democracy, the person who wins is oftentimes the one who can tell the crowd what it wants to hear, who flatters the majority, gets them on their side, who simplifies complex problems into emotionally satisfying narratives to get the crowd riled up, and who performs rather than actually governs. And so the leader becomes a performer rather than a governor. Plato, building on Socrates in his work called The Republic, called this figure the democratic man. It's someone who gives the crowd whatever it desires in the moment, regardless of what is good for them or the nation in the long term. Now, while it's later in Rome, you see something similar happening like in the movie Gladiator, when the people are starving and frustrated with Rome and all that's going on, and the Caesar, the leader, basically just says, let's give them a party, let's give them the games, so they ignore what the actual issues are. And this is exactly what's going on here, that Socrates is having a problem with this. And here's the darkest part of Socrates' diagnosis. He believed this dynamic was a bug in democracy, so to speak. He believed that it was a feature, that it was a mainstay within it, and he believed that the system itself would fail because of it. And then Socrates, or more precisely Plato, channeling Socrates in the Republic, described a trajectory that reads, to the modern reader like you and I, as almost uncomfortably familiar. He argues that democracies over time become increasingly chaotic. Different factions demand different things. Power becomes fragmented, conflict becomes constant, and the noise never stops. And over time, citizens become exhausted. Not just political exhaustion, but existentially exhausted to the depths of who they are. They stop wanting the freedom that democracy promises, because freedom in practice feels a lot like instability. You got all this freedom going on and it just feels unstable. It feels like nothing is ever resolved. It feels like we're just constantly arguing forever and never actually making a point, never getting anywhere with the argument. And when people reach that point of exhaustion, Socrates argued that they become vulnerable to a very specific offer. And the offer is this: it's the offer of order. We're tired of the instability. We want order. Therefore, a strong leader emerges who promises to cut through the chaos, who promises safety, who promises to silence the enemy and restore stability. The people, the same people who built the democratic system and tradition in the first place, begin gradually to support the leader's consolidation of power. Socrates called this the inevitable drift from democracy to tyranny, not through conquest, but through exhaustion, the exhaustion of freedom, through the slow surrender of freedom by people who simply cannot take the noise anymore, and they're tired of all this exhaustion, this noise that comes from freedom. Therefore, they are actually start to become more in an emperor style and in a tyranny type style. He did not offer this as a theory. He watched it happen in Athens around him in real time. And Athens was not alone. The Roman Republic, which nowadays many historians and the American founders themselves considered a more sophisticated model, and we kind of build our model off of, the Roman Republic lived out the same trajectory over 5 centuries. Rome built real safeguards. They built a Senate, 2 elected consuls who could veto each other. They had the written law, the 12 tables. They had the separation of powers. There were serious institutional protections against any person accumulating too much power. And yet Rome still ended with a Caesar, an emperor, a one-man ruler. Not because the system wasn't designed well, but because the people and leaders within the system stopped honoring it. Civil war, political exhaustion, the rise of ambitious men who exploited the chaos started happening, and finally you end up with Julius Caesar. The Roman Republic collapsed from within. Now it kind of moves from a republic into an empire. Now, the American founders in the United States, now they knew this all too well. They had studied Athens, they had studied Rome, they knew all about Socrates and Plato writing about Socrates. In fact, James Madison wrote directly in the Federalist number 10 papers that he wrote about the dangers of a pure democracy. Our founding fathers were so shaped by Rome that they named part of our government the Senate, the upper chamber. They signed their essays defending the Constitution under the pen name Publius, which is one of the founding members of the Roman Republic. And they built something deliberately different from the pure Athenian democracy that Socrates had such an issue with. They built what we would call now a constitutional republic. Now, this is important because a lot of people think America is a democracy. We're not. We're a constitutional republic. We have representatives, not direct votes on every law. A constitution that even the majority cannot override. We have a Bill of Rights that protects individuals from the crowd. Separation of powers that happens within our government. A Senate designed specifically to slow things down and cool off the popular passion of the populace a lot of times, right? That almost rhymes, doesn't it? The core American insight, directly informed by the Socratic critique, Socrates' critique, was this: the majority rules, but not absolutely. That's key. The majority rules, but not absolutely. Certain things can be voted away no matter how many hands go up, right? We have these certain unalienable rights, these certain things that we have. And whether that design is sufficient, whether those safeguards hold, whether the institutions are being honored, those are questions each generation has to answer for itself. Now, as we begin to wrap up, and we're going to take this further in some other conversations in the next few weeks, so don't miss it. But I want you to hear this with maybe the most force of everything I've said so far. Socrates spent his entire life warning against the danger of uninformed crowds and how dangerous they could be. And in the end, an uninformed crowd is ultimately what killed him. In 399 BC, Socrates went on trial in Athens. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. He was brought before a jury of 501 ordinary citizens. Mark that. Not philosophers, not trained jurists, not experts in the law. They were anything but experts. They were not philosophers who were even on the jury of this great philosopher. They were not experts in anything relevant to the charges. They were simply citizens of Athens. And the jury voted to execute him 280 to 221. Now, after this trial, Socrates had the opportunity to propose an alternate punishment and avoid death. He could have suggested exile. He could have proposed a fine or something like that. Instead, he was so irritated by the whole proceeding and what he had been predicting for so long that he suggested that the city actually owed him free meals for life because he had spent his entire life serving Athens by making its citizens think more carefully. The jury then got offended with everything and voted for the death penalty by an even larger amount in the second vote than the first vote. So in the end, democracy proved Socrates' point in the most precise and brutal way imaginable. A crowd of uninformed citizens, inflamed by emotion and manipulated by rhetoric, voted to silence the man who had dedicated his life to asking better questions. What do we do with all this? Well, you got to understand this. Socrates was not an enemy of freedom. He was an enemy of the idea that truth is whatever the majority decides it is. He believed that ignorance, given power, will always eventually destroy the society that empowers it. Let that sink in. I'm just going to repeat myself just so you can understand this. Socrates believed that ignorance given power will always eventually destroy the society that empowers it. And the question that he leaves us with, the question that is still alive to us today, 2,400 years later, is this. Are we building systems, communities, institutions that reward wisdom, or are we building ones that reward performance? Are we asking harder questions, or are we just getting better at applauding the people who tell us what we want to hear? Socrates died for asking that question. The least we can do is let it sit with us today. Now, next week, we are going to take that question even deeper and talk about why institutions and governments frequently struggle with philosophers who ask those kinds of deep questions. But that's where we want to land today. And I hope this episode blessed you. I hope it encouraged you. I hope it was thought-provoking for you. I hope it makes you sharper as you think about governmental systems. And we're going to be in philosophy for the next couple weeks. I promise you, if you enjoyed today, you'll enjoy these other weeks. They're going to be a lot of fun. Now, in the meantime, if you love this episode or if you know somebody you need to share it with, do me a favor and share it. Make sure you like and subscribe. If you're at a place where you can rate this episode, if you could give us a 5-star rating, that would be awesome as well. And as always, the future isn't just something that happens to you, it's something you create. I look forward to creating the future with you again next week.